Have you ever been forced to choose between staying silent or standing up for someone you love, even when the odds were stacked against you? Imagine this: a mother and her 8-year-old son are told to give up their rightful seats on a plane, not because of safety, not because of policy, but because someone thought they didn't belong there. In that moment, the boy had a choice: stay quiet, like so many do, or speak. And what he did next stunned everyone. With a voice steady beyond his years, he quoted the very laws that were supposed to protect him and his mom. He stood up to authority, to prejudice, to silence itself. Now, pause for a second. If it were you, if it were your child, what would you hope they'd do? Would they shrink back, or would they dare to speak truth, even when their voice shakes? This is not just a story about a flight. It's about dignity, justice, and the courage it takes to change the world, even at 30,000 feet. Stay with us. And if this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, because tonight we begin the journey together. The cabin lights glowed softly, casting a warm golden hue over the rows of polished leather seats in first class. Outside the wide oval windows, Columbus's late afternoon sky flickered with streaks of orange and lavender as the last few passengers boarded Midwest Airlines Flight 178 bound for Denver. It was supposed to be a routine trip, nothing more than a father and his young son traveling together. But in just a few minutes, the entire cabin would witness something unforgettable. Jonathan Reed adjusted his tie and glanced at his son, Caleb, who was fiddling with a worn deck of flashcards. The boy's small fingers flipped through each card with purpose, whispering words to himself, phrases from old law books, sections of civil rights statutes that he'd memorized just to keep his father proud. Jonathan smiled faintly. At only 8 years old, Caleb had an unusual hobby for a child his age. Other boys his grade loved baseball cards or superheroes. Caleb loved legal precedents. "Dad," Caleb whispered, his voice a mix of curiosity and pride. "Did you know Title II of the Civil Rights Act makes it illegal for public places to deny service because of race?" Jonathan chuckled, patting his son's shoulder. "I know, son, and one day you'll argue that better than anyone in a courtroom." Their bond was quiet, deep, forged in loss. 3 years earlier, Jonathan's wife, Caleb's mother, had passed away after a long illness. Since then, father and son had become inseparable, carrying each other through grief with love and resilience. For Jonathan, CEO of Reed Global Holdings, one of the fastest-rising consulting firms in the country, the world often saw him as powerful, unshakable. But here, with Caleb, he was simply Dad, the man who packed school lunches, practiced spelling words, and tried to keep bedtime stories interesting. The last passenger stowed her bag in the overhead compartment. Flight attendants began their ritual checks, polite smiles masking exhaustion. And that was when a shadow fell over Jonathan's brow. "Sir," a sharp voice cut through the ambient noise. "Are you sure these are your seats?" Jonathan looked up slowly. Standing before him was a tall woman in a crisp navy uniform. Her name tag read Karen Mitchell. Her eyes, however, carried something beyond routine professionalism, an edge of suspicion, almost disdain. "Yes," Jonathan replied evenly, sliding the boarding passes from the pocket of his jacket. "Seats 2A and 2B. Paid for. Confirmed." He handed the slips of paper with a calm smile. Karen's eyes darted to the tickets, then back to Jonathan and his son. Her lips pursed. "I see. It's just unusual." Jonathan's smile thinned. "Unusual." Karen hesitated, shifting her weight. "Well, we often have issues with seat assignments up here. Mistakes in the system. I'll need to double-check." Caleb's small brows furrowed. He tugged gently at his father's sleeve. "Dad, why is she asking again? We're already sitting where our tickets say." Jonathan placed a hand over his son's, steadying him. Inside, however, something flared. He knew this tone. He'd heard it in boardrooms, restaurants, even on sidewalks. A tone that didn't question the ticket, but the right of the person holding it. Karen leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice though the edge remained. It would be easier if you moved to economy. Just for this flight. Jonathan inhaled slowly, willing his temper into silence. He could feel the eyes of other passengers prickling at the back of his neck. Some curious, others judgmental. He'd been in enough rooms to recognize that hush, the quiet calculation people made when they assumed a black man didn't belong. "I paid for these seats," Jonathan said, his tone measured but firm. "We're not moving." Karen's jaw tightened, "Sir," before she could finish. A man across the aisle let out a soft, derisive chuckle. Middle-aged, suited, cufflinks catching the light. Robert Kane. Jonathan had noticed him earlier during boarding, the kind of traveler who radiated entitlement. "Don't waste your time, miss," Robert drawled loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "We all know what this is. They don't belong up here. Let them sit in the back where they fit in." The words landed like a blow. Caleb stiffened. His small hands clenched around the flashcards until the edges bent. Jonathan's heart thundered, but he kept his expression still. Years of executive poise, years of swallowing indignities to fight battles strategically, it all came back in this moment. But now, it wasn't just about him. His son was watching, learning. Karen shifted uneasily but didn't correct Robert. Instead, she crossed her arms, as if waiting for Jonathan to comply. Dad Caleb's voice was barely above a whisper. "Is this because we're black?" Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, fighting the ache in his chest. He wanted to shield his boy from that truth for as long as possible. But life, it seemed, had chosen this very moment to rip away the veil. The cabin grew quieter, sensing the tension. A woman in the row behind adjusted her glasses, watching carefully. An elderly man 2 seats away leaned forward, curiosity written across his lined face. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his hand tightening around Caleb's. His son's eyes, wide, searching, expectant, looked up at him with a question that demanded more than comfort. It demanded courage. And though Jonathan didn't know it yet, it would be Caleb, not him, who would rise to give the cabin an answer. Jonathan Reed had learned long ago how to wear composure like armor. On conference stages, in negotiation rooms lined with mahogany tables, and in shareholder meetings that bristled with veiled doubt about his leadership. He had mastered the art of staying steady while the storm raged around him. People mistook that calm for ease. They never guessed at the discipline it took, the constant balancing act between dignity and the unspoken expectation that he had to be twice as good to be seen as equal. That instinct to keep his composure was firing now, here in the close quarters of the aircraft cabin, but this was not a boardroom with quarterly numbers at stake. This was his son's heart, his son's innocence, teetering on the edge of awakening to a world that was not always kind, not always fair. Jonathan shifted slightly in his seat, forcing his breathing to steady. Caleb had tucked the bent flashcards into the seat pocket, his small face serious, searching. The boy was perceptive, too perceptive for his age. Jonathan remembered how his wife, Alana, used to laugh and say, "This one sees everything. We can't hide the world from him." The memory ached. Alana had been the soft counterweight to Jonathan's steady resolve. When illness took her 3 years ago, it nearly broke him. He had buried himself in work, in raising Caleb, in the hope that if he built enough, achieved enough, maybe the world would be gentler to the boy who carried both his mother's bright eyes and his father's quiet determination. Caleb leaned closer now, whispering, Dad, why does she think we don't belong here? You said if we work hard, we can sit anywhere we earn. Jonathan swallowed. You're right, son, and you did earn this seat, every bit as much as anyone else. But she doesn't believe it. Caleb's words were simple, but they carried the sting of truth. Jonathan pressed his hand against his son's, firm and warm. Sometimes people carry ideas that aren't fair. But our job is to stand steady. Not every battle is fought with raised voices. He didn't say what he was truly thinking. How many more times will I have to explain this? How many times will you be forced to see it? The boy's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in concentration. Jonathan could almost see the cogs turning. Caleb had always been like this, absorbing information, turning it over in his mind until he understood it fully. While other kids at school bragged about video games or baseball stats, Caleb rattled off court cases, memorized from evenings spent flipping through Jonathan's law journals. One memory surfaced unbidden Caleb, only 6, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, asking, Dad, what's Brown v. Board of Education? Jonathan had tried to simplify it, to explain that once upon a time, kids who looked like them weren't allowed in the same schools as kids who didn't. Caleb had frowned, shaken his head, and said, That's wrong. If it's wrong, then it's wrong now. The flight attendant, Karen Mitchell, had stepped away briefly, conferring with another crew member at the galley. Jonathan could feel the weight of the cabin's eyes, the hush that wasn't silence, but a hum of judgment. Some passengers pretended not to notice. Others glanced openly, curious, some skeptical. A few rows back, an older man adjusted the brim of his veteran's cap. Frank Dawson. His lined face was stoic, but his gaze lingered on Jonathan and Caleb with something softer, something like recognition. Across the aisle, Robert Kane reclined with smug ease, checking his phone, clearly satisfied with the disruption he had provoked. Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes on Caleb. Jonathan's own journey had been lined with such moments. He remembered being 22, fresh out of college, walking into his first corporate interview. The recruiter had glanced at his resume, then at his skin, and asked, Are you sure you're in the right room? He remembered the sting, the way his throat had closed, the way he had forced himself to answer calmly while something inside him wanted to shout. He thought of that moment now, and how it had hardened into resolve. It had taught him the power of knowing the rules, the law, the contracts, because once you knew them, no one could twist them against you. That was why he'd studied late nights, climbed the ladder, built Reed Global Holdings from a small consultancy into a multi-million-dollar firm. Knowledge was protection. Knowledge was power. Caleb, watching now, was inheriting that lesson sooner than Jonathan had ever wished. Karen returned, her expression cooler, more determined. Sir, I'll need to ask you again. These seats may not be correct. We can sort this out more easily if you move to economy for now. Jonathan's lips parted, but Caleb spoke first. His voice was small but steady. Our boarding passes say 2A and 2B. That's where we are sitting. It's not a mistake. Jonathan's head turned sharply, meeting his son's eyes. Caleb's tone carried no anger, just clarity, the kind that cut sharper than indignation. Karen blinked, momentarily unsettled, then glanced around as though hoping for support. Instead, she met the curious gaze of Helen Brooks, a professor traveling with a stack of papers marked in red pen. Helen tilted her head, thoughtful, as though filing the moment away for later reflection. Robert chuckled again, low and mocking. Cute. The kid's got a mouth. Jonathan felt the heat rise in his chest. He forced himself still. The armor held, but cracks were forming, because it wasn't just him absorbing this now. It was Caleb. The plane door closed with a metallic thud. The jetway pulled back. Engines hummed low and steady, a reminder that soon they would be airborne. But here, in row 2, gravity was shifting in another way entirely. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, inhaling the recycled air, steadying his thoughts. He had promised himself he would always shield Caleb from pain where he could. But maybe, just maybe, this was one battle he couldn't fight for his son. Perhaps it was one his son was already choosing to fight for himself. And Jonathan, for the first time in a long time, wasn't sure if that frightened him or made him proud. As the aircraft lurched slightly, preparing for taxi, Caleb reached again for his flashcards. His lips moved silently, rehearsing the words he had memorized. Title II, Civil Rights Act, Public Accommodations, Contract of Carriage. Jonathan watched, heart heavy yet swelling with something else, an inkling of what was to come. This flight would not be routine, and his 8-year-old son was about to teach everyone on board what justice sounded like. The aircraft had begun its slow crawl toward the runway. The cabin filled with the soft hum of engines, the click of seat belts, the shuffle of passengers settling in. But in row 2, the tension had a pulse of its own. Karen Mitchell lingered like a shadow. Her arms folded, her stance stiff with authority she was determined to assert. Jonathan Reed stared straight ahead, jaw tight. He had weathered countless boardroom standoffs, survived hostile takeovers and media scrutiny, but this was different. This was not about strategy or reputation. This was about dignity, his and his son's. Caleb's small voice cut into the silence. Dad, if the tickets say this is our seat, then that's the contract, right? They can't just change it because they feel like it. Jonathan turned, meeting his son's steady gaze. Behind the innocence of the question, there was something sharper, a clarity Jonathan recognized. He saw himself at that age, asking his father why doors always seemed harder to open for them. Except now, it was Caleb holding the question, waiting for him to confirm the truth. Yes, Jonathan said softly. That's exactly right. Karen exhaled sharply. Sir, I don't need a lecture on airline policies from an 8-year-old. I'm simply trying to resolve a seating error. Error, Jonathan's voice was calm but edged. The only error here is assuming we don't belong. A few heads turned at that. Robert Kane smirked, clearly amused by the rising tension. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. Well, someone had to say it, he muttered, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Caleb's fingers brushed the edge of his flashcards again, almost unconsciously. His lips moved silently, rehearsing phrases he'd studied. Jonathan noticed and felt a pang part pride, part fear. Across the aisle, Helen Brooks finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, professorial, yet carried weight. Excuse me, but the boarding passes clearly match their seats. I've seen them. There doesn't seem to be an error. Karen flushed slightly, caught off guard by the intervention. She opened her mouth, but before she could respond, Frank Dawson adjusted his veteran's cap and leaned forward. His voice was gravelly but firm. The boy's right. Contract's a contract. I've fought for a country where the rules apply to everyone. Don't go bending them now. A murmur rippled through the cabin. The unspoken consensus was shifting, but not everyone was convinced. A man in the back muttered something under his breath. A woman glanced nervously at Karen, as though silently urging her to back down. Jonathan felt the weight of it all pressing against him. He knew this moment could break in any direction. He also knew his son was watching, absorbing every second. Karen straightened, retreating slightly but not conceding. "I'll call the supervisor," she said finally, her tone clipped. With that, she walked briskly toward the galley, heels tapping against the narrow aisle. Silence lingered after her departure, heavy and expectant. Jonathan rubbed his temples, feeling the beginnings of a headache. Caleb looked up at him, eyes shining with both fear and determination. "Dad," Caleb whispered, "should I say something when he comes back?" About the law, Jonathan hesitated. His instinct screamed to shield him, to say no. This was his burden to carry, not his son's. But another thought pushed through. Maybe this is Caleb's moment. Maybe he needs to see his own voice has power. He studied his boy's face, the earnest courage etched into it. Finally, Jonathan nodded. "If you feel it's right, then yes, speak the truth. But remember, son, truth doesn't need anger. It just needs to be steady." Caleb nodded, gripping the flashcards tighter. Moments later, Karen returned with Paul Denton, the supervisor. Paul was taller, his expression professional but wary, as if already weary of conflict. He stopped at row 2, clearing his throat. "Sir, ma'am," he began, glancing at Karen. Then, "Jonathan, I understand there's a dispute about these seats. I'd like to resolve this quickly so we can have a smooth flight." Jonathan held out the boarding passes again. "There is no dispute. We purchased these seats. We're sitting in them." Paul examined the tickets, brows furrowing. His tone, however, was carefully neutral. "There does appear to be a discrepancy in the system. To avoid further delays, I'd ask you to cooperate and relocate to economy for this flight. You'll be compensated." Caleb's voice rang out before Jonathan could respond. Clear, high, unshaken. "That's not fair. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 says public accommodations can't discriminate because of race. An airline is a public accommodation. And your own contract of carriage says passengers with confirmed tickets can't be reassigned without cause. We have confirmed tickets. We're not moving." The cabin froze. Dozens of eyes turned toward the small boy in seat 2B, his legs barely reaching the edge of the cushion, his voice cutting through the recycled air with startling precision. Paul blinked, momentarily stunned. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. Robert Kane let out a bark of laughter, though it sounded forced. "Well, that's a first. Kid thinks he's a lawyer." Caleb didn't flinch. His chin lifted slightly, his eyes steady. "I don't think I'm a lawyer. I'm just saying the rules. And the rules are supposed to be the same for everyone." A beat of silence followed. Then Frank Dawson spoke again, louder this time. "He's right. If you move them, you're proving the boy correct that the rules don't apply equally, and I won't sit by and watch that happen." Applause didn't erupt. Not yet, but there was a ripple of agreement, murmurs, nods, the subtle shift of people aligning. Helen Brooks scribbled something onto her notepad, her lips pursed in thought. Jonathan's heart pounded. He wanted to reach out, to pull his son close, to protect him from the weight of this moment, but he also felt a fierce surge of pride. Caleb had spoken with clarity, with truth, and the truth had power. Paul shifted, clearly unsettled by the boy's words and the murmuring passengers. He glanced at Karen, whose jaw was tight with frustration. Then back at Jonathan. "We'll review this further. Please remain seated for now." With that, he retreated toward the front of the cabin, Karen trailing close behind. The hum of the engines continued, steady and unbothered, as though unaware of the storm brewing in row 2. Jonathan exhaled slowly, finally turning to his son. "You did well," he whispered. "Very well." Caleb leaned against him, small shoulders firm with determination. "I just said what was right. If the law is for everyone, then it's for us too." Jonathan closed his eyes, holding back the sting of tears. His son was right, and for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt the fragile beginnings of something stronger than anger: hope. The engines roared as the aircraft lifted from the ground, pressing passengers gently back into their seats. The city lights of Columbus shrank beneath them, giving way to a blanket of dusky clouds. Flight 178 was officially airborne, but the air inside the cabin was far from calm. Jonathan Reed sat upright, his hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder. He had thought the confrontation might end once the supervisor walked away, yet his instincts told him otherwise. There was an unsettled energy swirling through the front rows, the kind that didn't fade with altitude. Caleb held his flashcards close, his lips moving silently as if rehearsing lines only he could hear. His small body seemed tense, but his eyes glowed with a strange mixture of fear and determination. Jonathan wanted to tell him to put the cards away, to let it go. But he knew deep down that stopping his son now would be like silencing a flame. Across the aisle, Robert Kane ordered a scotch from another attendant, his smirk lingering as if amused by the scene. "You see," he muttered toward no one in particular. "Already making trouble. Some people just don't know their place." The words carried easily in the hushed cabin. Jonathan's chest tightened. He glanced around, half expecting someone to object, to push back against Kane's sneer, but no one did. Some passengers looked away, others buried themselves in their magazines or screens. Silence, Jonathan knew too well, was often the accomplice of prejudice. Caleb's small hand tightened into a fist. He turned to his father, whispering, "Dad, why don't they say anything? They hear it. Why don't they stop him?" Jonathan sighed, because sometimes silence feels safer than truth. But that doesn't make it right. Caleb stared down at his lap, his jaw working as though chewing on words he wasn't sure he should say. Jonathan recognized that look, the exact same expression he himself wore in boardrooms when weighing the cost of speaking up against the convenience of staying quiet. The seatbelt light chimed off, and attendants began moving with trays. Karen reappeared at the front of the cabin, her smile painted thin as she leaned close to Paul Denton, whispering furiously. Jonathan couldn't hear the words, but he caught the gestures, a quick point toward row 2, an exasperated roll of her eyes. Paul rubbed his temples, clearly tired of the brewing storm. Caleb straightened suddenly, his eyes sharp. He pulled a card from the deck and held it like a shield. In a voice that carried further than Jonathan expected, he said, "The rules matter. They don't change because of someone's opinion." Every head in first class turned. Jonathan's stomach dropped, but Caleb continued, his voice stronger this time. "If you say the rules don't apply to us, then what's the point of having rules at all?" Karen froze mid-step. Robert Kane snorted, his drink sloshing in the glass. "Listen to the little preacher. You think quoting books will change the world." Kid Caleb looked at him directly, eyes steady. "It already does. That's why people wrote them down, so no one could pretend not to know." The cabin rippled with whispers. A woman in row 3 leaned forward, her phone discreetly angled to record. Helen Brooks, the professor, scribbled rapidly in her notepad. Frank Dawson sat straighter, his weathered hands gripping the armrest, his expression resolute. Jonathan felt a rush of conflicting emotions, fear for his son's safety, pride at his courage, sorrow that an 8-year-old even needed such strength. His mind churned. Should I stop him? Should I let him keep going? But Caleb's words seemed to break something loose in the cabin. A man 2 rows back muttered, "He's right, you know." A woman across the aisle nodded faintly, her expression troubled. Karen's face flushed, her authority unraveling in the face of a child's conviction. She opened her mouth, but Paul stepped forward before she could speak. "All right, that's enough," he said, his voice raised slightly. "We're not having a debate in the aisle." Caleb's voice rang out once more, clear and direct. "It's not a debate if the law is already written." The silence that followed was louder than any outburst. Jonathan's pulse hammered in his ears. He could see Karen's jaw clench, her eyes flicking nervously toward passengers who were now watching her more than him. Robert Kane downed his scotch and slammed the glass onto his tray. "Ridiculous. Catering to theatrics. Next thing you know, the kid will want to run the airline." Frank Dawson finally spoke, his voice booming across the cabin. "Better him than you. At least he's talking sense." A ripple of laughter and applause broke through, brief but enough to tip the balance of the room. Caleb blinked, startled by the support, then sat back, shoulders trembling with adrenaline. Jonathan bent close, whispering into his ear, "You were brave, son, but remember, courage isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about standing steady." Caleb nodded, his small chest rising and falling rapidly. Jonathan leaned back, his own thoughts tumbling. He had spent a lifetime building armor to withstand these moments, preparing arguments, crafting strategies. Yet here was his son, unarmored, speaking raw truth, and it was working. People were listening. He thought of Alana again, her voice soft but firm the night she told him, "Don't hide the world from him, John. Teach him to face it. Teach him to speak." The aircraft jolted slightly through turbulence, coffee cups trembling on trays. The moment seemed to stretch, charged with the weight of more than just a seating dispute. Jonathan sensed this was no longer about 2 seats in first class. It was about something larger, the quiet reckoning of a society inside a pressurized cabin 30,000 feet above the ground, and at its center stood an 8-year-old boy refusing to shrink. Jonathan's heart swelled with something fierce and unyielding. He reached for Caleb's hand, squeezing it gently. "Whatever happens next, you're not alone." The boy squeezed back. "I know, Dad, but neither are you." Jonathan glanced around the cabin at faces shifting, minds stirring. He realized his son was right. For the first time in a long time, he felt the tide turning, not because of his wealth, not because of his title, but because truth, spoken plainly, still had the power to move people. The storm was far from over, but the fire had been lit, and Jonathan knew there would be no putting it out now. The flight had reached cruising altitude, but inside the cabin the atmosphere still buzzed with unease. A handful of passengers whispered to one another, their voices hushed yet urgent. Others kept sneaking glances toward row 2, where an 8-year-old boy had just shifted the balance of an entire flight. Jonathan Reed felt the weight of those glances. He adjusted his tie, a reflex more than a necessity, and studied Caleb beside him. The boy had gone quiet now, but Jonathan recognized the look in his eyes alive, electric, yet shadowed by a question he was too young to carry. Had I gone too far? Jonathan leaned close. "You were clear. Son, that matters. Don't second-guess yourself." Caleb nodded faintly, but his fingers fidgeted with the edges of his flashcards. He whispered, almost to himself, "They won't stop unless someone makes them." Jonathan's heart clenched. He had spent decades navigating this same terrain, walking the fine line between enduring and confronting, calculating which battles to fight and which to let pass. He wondered, not for the first time, if his careful strategies had cost something deeper. His son's words echoed a truth he had buried: silence never changed a system. At the front of the cabin, Paul Denton spoke quietly into the interphone, his voice carrying the clipped cadence of someone seeking higher approval. Jonathan guessed he was contacting the captain. Karen hovered near him, arms folded, her jaw set in grim determination. Robert Kane shifted again, restless and irritated. "Unbelievable," he muttered, his words dripping disdain. "We're at 30,000 feet and still wasting time on this nonsense." Jonathan turned his head slowly, locking eyes with Kane. His tone was steady, deliberate. "What you call nonsense is my son's dignity. And mine." For the first time, Kane seemed unsettled. He looked away, muttering under his breath, but no longer loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. Helen Brooks observed quietly, her pen scratching against paper. Jonathan could see the sharp focus in her eyes. This wasn't mere note-taking. It was documentation, a record. She was the type who would later distill truth into words that cut deeper than argument. The interphone clicked as Paul ended the call. He turned back toward row 2, his face neutral, but his shoulders tense. "Mr. Reed," he said, voice formal. "The captain has been informed. He expects passengers to comply with crew instructions for safety reasons. If this continues, we may need to involve security upon landing." Gasps rustled through the rows. Caleb's head snapped up, his eyes wide. Jonathan's chest burned. "Security," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. For occupying the seats we purchased, Paul's voice faltered slightly, but pressed on. "It's standard procedure when there's a disruption." Before Jonathan could answer, Caleb spoke. His voice was steady, but louder than before. "My dad isn't disrupting. He's following the contract. You're the ones breaking it." The words struck like a bell. A man in row 4 clapped softly, then stopped as if realizing he had acted impulsively. Still, the effect lingered. A ripple of recognition moved through the passengers. Frank Dawson rose slightly in his seat, ignoring the fastened seatbelt sign. His voice was gravel and steel. "I served this country so kids like him wouldn't be silenced. If you try to punish them for sitting where they belong, you'll have to answer to me too." Applause broke out this time, hesitant at first, then stronger. Even some passengers who had remained silent began to nod, emboldened by the veteran's stance. Karen's face flushed crimson. She turned sharply to Paul. "This is getting out of hand. We need to reassert authority before," but Paul held up a hand, silencing her. His eyes swept the cabin, calculating. He was not a man motivated by conviction, but by practicality. And practicality told him the tide had turned. Jonathan exhaled slowly, steadying his breath. For years he had fought battles in rooms where no one dared clap, where victories were measured in contracts signed under fluorescent lights. But here, in this narrow aisle high above the clouds, support was breaking through. Caleb leaned into him, whispering, "Dad, do you think they'll really call the police?" Jonathan's heart twisted. He could not lie. They might try. "But listen to me, Caleb, whatever happens, you've already done something important. You've shown them the truth." The boy's small hand slipped into his father's. Jonathan squeezed it gently, silently promising that whatever storm was coming, they would face it together. Suddenly, Helen Brooks rose from her seat, her notepad clutched to her chest. Her voice carried the crisp authority of a professor used to lecture halls. "For the record, I've witnessed everything. If there are repercussions against this family, I will testify. And I'm certain I'm not the only one." More passengers voiced agreement, soft but audible affirmations that they, too, had seen, that they would not remain silent. Jonathan's throat tightened. For years he had doubted whether moments like this were possible, that people would risk stepping out of silence. Yet here it was, unfolding in real time. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. She retreated down the aisle, her authority unraveling with each step. Paul followed more slowly, glancing back once at Jonathan, as if to say, "This isn't over." The cabin quieted again, but it was no longer the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of tension waiting for resolution, of hearts beating faster because something irreversible had begun. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, his chest rising and falling with the weight of it all. He thought of Alana again, how she used to say, "Change comes in small eruptions before the quake." He wondered if this was one of those eruptions. Beside him, Caleb sat taller than before. His shoulders were squared, his flashcards forgotten on his lap. He whispered, almost to himself, "It's working. Dad, they're listening." Jonathan looked at him, his son, 8 years old, carrying the fire of generations in his small frame. He felt pride, fear, grief, and hope tangled all at once. "Yes," he said softly, "they are." And though the engines droned steadily, Jonathan knew this flight was no longer a simple journey from one city to another. It was becoming a crucible one that would test not just a father and son, but everyone aboard. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants prepared for meal service, but in row 2, no one was thinking about food. The air was taut, stretched thin, like a violin string about to snap. Jonathan Reed sat motionless, one hand wrapped around Caleb's smaller one. The boy's flashcards rested forgotten, a paper fortress that had already proven its worth. Across the aisle, Robert Kane swirled the last of his second scotch, his smirk masking something unsettled. Jonathan could sense it. The bravado was cracking. Kane leaned forward suddenly, his voice low but venomous. "You've turned this whole flight into a circus. Congratulations. Hope you're proud." Jonathan turned his head, meeting the man's eyes squarely. "I am proud of my son, of the truth he spoke." Kane scoffed, but Jonathan caught the flicker of discomfort in his gaze. The mockery no longer landed the way it had earlier. Caleb, emboldened by his father's words, added softly but firmly, "Sometimes you need a circus to show what's wrong with the show." A ripple of laughter spread through nearby rows, small, supportive. Even a flight attendant at the back suppressed a grin before quickly turning away. Jonathan's chest warmed. He hadn't expected his son to meet venom with wit, but the boy's instinct was sharper than he realized. At the front, Karen Mitchell whispered furiously to Paul Denton again. Jonathan noticed the way her hands moved, sharp gestures betraying her frustration. Paul listened, but his eyes flicked back toward the passengers who were clearly siding against her. He was a man trapped, caught between protocol and a shifting tide of public opinion. Then the interphone chimed again. Paul picked it up, his voice tight. He listened for a long moment, then nodded curtly. When he hung up, his jaw was set. He strode back to row 2. "Mr. Reed," he said, tone clipped, "the captain has decided this matter is disrupting the flight. He's asked that you and your son remain seated for now, but upon arrival in Denver, airport security will meet the plane. We'll sort it out then." Caleb's hand squeezed Jonathan's with sudden force. His wide eyes searched his father's face. Jonathan felt a jolt of fury, but he kept his voice measured. Security for sitting in seats we paid for. Paul's voice was apologetic, but firm. "I don't make the call, sir. I enforce it." Jonathan opened his mouth to argue, but Caleb spoke first. His voice was stronger than Jonathan had ever heard. "You can call security if you want, but you should know Section 403 of your own contract of carriage says you can't deny service to passengers who haven't broken safety rules. We didn't break any. If you punish us, you're breaking your own rules, and everyone here knows it now." Dozens of eyes swung back to Paul. Silence hung heavy. Caleb's words were not childish outbursts. They were a mirror, forcing everyone to see the truth. Robert Kane chuckled, but it rang hollow. "Kid's been reading too many books." Helen Brooks rose halfway from her seat. Her voice, clear and unwavering, cut through the tension. He's quoting correctly. "I've read the document myself. I teach contract law." She held up her notepad, her academic authority reinforcing the boy's claim. Paul froze, caught between an 8-year-old and a law professor, both calling his bluff. Frank Dawson's gravelly voice joined in. "You bring security to meet this plane. You'll be the ones explaining why a child had to remind you of the law, and I'll be standing right beside him when you do." The murmur in the cabin grew louder, supportive voices layering into something undeniable. The authority that Karen and Paul had leaned on was crumbling with each passing second. Jonathan felt his chest tighten, pride swelling against his fear. He leaned close to his son. "You've lit a fire, Caleb. Now it's burning too bright for them to ignore." Caleb looked up, his small face determined. "Then we can't let it go out." Paul exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Look, let's calm down. No decisions are final. Let's just get through the flight." He shot Karen a sharp look that silenced her before she could protest. Jonathan leaned back, his hand never leaving Caleb's. He felt the boy's heartbeat racing beneath his small palm. He whispered, "You were steady. That's what matters." But inside, Jonathan's own thoughts churned. He knew the system well too well. This wasn't over. He imagined the headlines already forming if they were escorted off the plane. Prominent CEO detained with child and seating dispute. The weight of perception, the sting of injustice it could destroy reputations in minutes. Yet as he looked at his son, he realized something profound. Caleb didn't care about headlines or image. He cared about truth. And in that moment, Jonathan wondered if his son had already surpassed him in courage. The plane jolted through turbulence, drinks sloshing in cups. Passengers gasped, then laughed nervously. The disruption seemed to break the tension for a moment, reminding everyone that they were all in the same sky, the same fragile tube of metal. Caleb leaned close. "Dad, do you think they'll change their minds?" Jonathan considered. "Maybe, maybe not, but they'll never forget what you said. None of us will." He glanced around the cabin faces of strangers who now looked at them not with suspicion, but with quiet respect. Even Robert Kane, though still scowling, shifted uncomfortably under the collective gaze. Jonathan thought of Alana again, her words echoing, "Teach him to face it. Teach him to speak." For the first time, he felt the full truth of what she had meant. The engines hummed, steady and relentless. Outside the window, stars glittered against a velvet sky. Jonathan tightened his grip on Caleb's hand. Whatever storm awaited them in Denver, he knew one thing for certain: his son had already turned this flight into more than a journey. He had turned it into a testimony. The cabin had grown oddly quiet, like the pause before a storm's next strike. The hum of the engines filled the air, steady and low, but everyone's focus remained locked on row 2. Jonathan Reed could feel it, dozens of strangers leaning into the moment, waiting to see what would come next. Caleb shifted in his seat, his legs dangling, his little sneakers brushing the floor. His hands gripped the armrest, but his expression was calmer than any 8-year-old should have to be. Jonathan studied him, marveling at the way the boy carried himself. He wondered if this was the very moment that would shape the rest of his son's life. Karen Mitchell reappeared with her service cart, forcing a smile so thin it looked painful. She began handing out drinks with mechanical precision, but when she reached row 2, her movements stiffened. She didn't look at Jonathan or Caleb. She set 2 plastic cups of water on their tray table with a snap, as if slamming down an unspoken warning. Jonathan picked up his cup slowly. "Thank you," he said, his voice level but edged. Karen's jaw flexed, her lips pressed tight. She moved on without replying. Caleb's small voice followed her retreat. "Dad, Why does she hate us so much? Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. The ache in his chest was sharper than before. It's not you she hates. It's the idea of us being equal. That's harder for some people to accept than it should be. Caleb nodded, absorbing the words with a seriousness that hurt Jonathan's heart. Then, from behind them, a voice rose. "He shouldn't have to explain that," said a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a sharp tone. She looked straight at Karen. "We all saw what happened. You didn't treat anyone else like that." Karen froze mid-aisle, her shoulders stiff. The woman continued, "You picked them because you thought you could get away with it. But you can't. Not anymore." The ripple spread again. Heads nodded. Murmurs of agreement floated through the air. Jonathan turned slightly, catching the woman's eye. She gave him a small, firm nod, solidarity in its simplest form. Robert Kane groaned audibly, muttering, "This is absurd. Mob justice in the sky." This time, Frank Dawson rose fully from his seat. His voice boomed across the cabin, commanding attention like the drill sergeant he once was. "No. What's absurd is watching a child have to fight for his seat while grown men sit in silence. I won't do it. Not on my watch." Applause erupted, louder than before. The sound rolled through first class, spilling into the rows behind. Jonathan felt Caleb's hand slip into his, squeezing tight. The boy's eyes shone, not with fear, but with hope. Paul Denton rushed forward, gesturing urgently. "Please, please, everyone, sit down, calm down. This is a flight, not a courtroom." Helen Brooks stood, her notepad tucked under one arm. "With respect, Mr. Denton, it became a courtroom the moment you threatened to sick security on a father and son who've broken no rules. And if you're concerned about order, you should know order comes from fairness, not force." Paul's face flushed, caught between authority and truth. He raised his hands helplessly. "We just need peace until landing." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of justice. Without that, there is no peace here." The words hung heavy, sinking into the cabin like stones into water. For a moment, even Robert Kane was silent. He looked away, his scowl faltering under the weight of so many eyes. Caleb whispered, barely audible, "Dad, they're with us." Jonathan looked around. For the first time since the confrontation began, he truly believed it. Passengers who had once turned away were now watching with sharpened focus. People who had once hidden behind silence were now stepping forward. The tide was shifting, not just toward them, but toward something larger. Paul swallowed hard. I'll speak to the captain again." His voice cracked with the strain of a man cornered. He retreated quickly to the front, Karen trailing behind, her expression stormy. Jonathan exhaled slowly, tension leaking from his shoulders. He turned to Caleb, brushing a hand over his son's curls. "You see what happens when one person speaks. It gives others the courage to do the same." Caleb leaned against him, whispering, "Then we can't stop now." Jonathan's throat tightened. He thought of Alana again, of her conviction that their son would be something extraordinary. Tonight, high above the clouds, Jonathan realized she had been right. The cabin fell into a quieter rhythm, but it wasn't the uneasy silence of before. It was something new, expectant, alive. Strangers glanced at one another with shared understanding, as though they had all become part of something greater than a single flight. Jonathan sipped his water, his mind racing. He knew they hadn't won. Not yet. The captain still held authority, and Denver security still loomed. But the balance had shifted, public opinion was no longer on the crew's side. And that, Jonathan knew, was power. He looked out the window. The stars stretched endlessly, cold and brilliant. Somewhere down below, cities pulsed with light. But here, above it all, in the quiet, pressurized cabin, something fragile yet profound had been born. Jonathan whispered to himself, almost a prayer, "Hold steady, hold steady." Beside him, Caleb sat upright, shoulders squared, his small frame brimming with a courage that seemed far too big for his age. The boy didn't know it yet, but he was no longer just a passenger on Flight 178. He had become its voice. The interphone chimed again, sharp and insistent. Every head in first class swiveled toward the front, where Paul Denton stood with his shoulders stiff, waiting for the captain's voice. The cabin, alive with whispers only minutes earlier, fell into a heavy hush. Jonathan Reed tightened his grip on Caleb's hand. He had been in enough high-stakes boardrooms to recognize the rhythm of pressure, calm before decision, silence before verdict, but never had the verdict carried such personal weight. Paul hung up the receiver slowly, his face unreadable. Karen Mitchell hovered at his side, her eyes glinting with anticipation. She wanted the captain to back her. Jonathan realized she needed him to... "Mr. Reed," Paul began, his voice carefully neutral. "The captain has instructed that we maintain safety and compliance. He's asked me to make clear that any further refusal to follow crew direction may result in intervention upon landing." A collective sigh rippled through the cabin. Not quite a decision, not quite an absolution. Ambiguity, Jonathan knew, was a shield for authority too cautious to take aside. Caleb sat taller. His small voice carried again, steady and cutting. "What direction did we refuse? We followed the rules. We sat in the seats we bought. If following the rules is refusing, then the rules don't mean anything." The boy's words rang through the cabin like a gavel. Jonathan's chest swelled, pride mixing with dread. Caleb wasn't just holding his ground, he was forcing everyone else to face the cracks in their logic. Robert Kane groaned dramatically, muttering loud enough for all to hear. "For God's sake, someone shut the kid up before he writes the Constitution." But his words fell flat this time. No chuckles followed. Instead, Helen Brooks stood, calm but unyielding. "Mr. Denton, the child is right. If security intervenes in Denver, it won't be on them, it will be on you. And on this airline, for violating your own contract and federal law. And you'll be dealing not just with me, but with every witness here." She gestured broadly, her gaze sweeping the rows. Dozens of passengers nodded. The middle-aged woman who had spoken earlier raised her phone, its camera already recording. "We are witnesses," she said firmly. "All of us." Paul's composure faltered. He glanced nervously at Karen, then at Jonathan, then back at the sea of eyes watching him. The authority he leaned on was evaporating, replaced by accountability he hadn't bargained for. Karen's lips pressed tight, a flush rising to her cheeks. "This is insubordination. You're letting a mob dictate Frank Dawson cut her off." His veteran's voice steady and unshakable. "No, ma'am. What you're seeing is people finally refusing to stay silent. There's a difference." Applause followed louder, more unified than before. The sound filled the cabin, undeniable and impossible to ignore. Jonathan exhaled slowly, keeping his voice low but firm as he leaned toward Paul. "You can escalate this and drag your airline into a scandal that will haunt you for years. Or you can do the simplest thing, let us sit in the seats we paid for, and let this flight continue in peace." Paul's eyes darted toward Caleb, who was still sitting upright, his expression solemn but resolute. Something shifted in the supervisor's gaze, then not quite surrender, not quite agreement, but the dawning awareness that the boy was not going to back down, and neither was the cabin. Karen hissed in frustration. "You're going to let a child dictate procedure?" Jonathan finally allowed a sharp edge into his tone. "No, he's not dictating procedure. He's reminding you what the law already says. That's the difference." For a moment, no one moved. The engines droned steadily beneath the silence. The tension felt as if it could crack the air itself. Then, the interphone crackled again. Paul snatched it up, listening intently. His expression shifted, eyes narrowing, then widening slightly. He replaced the receiver with deliberate care. "The captain has reconsidered," Paul announced, his voice more subdued now. "He's chosen not to escalate further. He asks that everyone remain seated and calm for the remainder of the flight. We'll resolve this matter on the ground, but no security will be waiting." Relief swept the cabin in a visible wave, murmurs of agreement, sighs of release, even a few claps. Karen stiffened, but Paul cut her off with a glance sharper than Jonathan expected. "That's the captain's decision." Karen's face burned crimson. She turned away abruptly, shoving the service cart toward the back of the cabin. Jonathan leaned back, exhaling deeply. His hand found Caleb's, squeezing tight. "It's not over, but for now, we're safe." Caleb nodded, his eyes wide. "Did we win?" Jonathan paused. He thought of battles fought in courtrooms, in negotiations, in the quiet dignity of refusing to move. He thought of his late wife, of the lessons he'd promised to pass on. "No," he said softly. "But we didn't lose, and sometimes that's the first step." Caleb seemed to consider this, then leaned against his father's side, his small frame finally relaxing. Around them, passengers exchanged glances that were no longer neutral, but bound by a quiet solidarity. The woman with the phone set it down, her recording safe. Helen Brooks returned to her seat, her notepad thick with notes. Frank Dawson crossed his arms, nodding with satisfaction. Even Robert Kane, though still scowling, remained silent. His mockery had lost its audience. Jonathan stared out the window at the endless, dark sky. The storm had eased for now, but he knew more lay ahead. The true reckoning would come in Denver. Still, as he looked down at his son, his 8-year-old who had forced a plane full of strangers to see truth, Jonathan felt something stir within him. Hope. For a time, the plane settled into an uneasy rhythm. Meal trays clinked, pages of magazines turned, and the low murmur of passengers resumed. Yet under it all, tension lingered, coiled like a spring waiting to snap again. Jonathan Reed felt it pressing against his chest. He studied Caleb, who had finally leaned back into his seat. The boy's eyelids fluttered, but he wasn't asleep, Jonathan could tell by the way his small fingers still tapped against the armrest, his mind turning over the night's events. 8 years old, Jonathan thought, and already carrying truths men twice his age still avoided. Jonathan turned his gaze to the window. The sky outside was an ocean of black, punctured by cold stars. Somewhere far below, the world spun on with all its complications and cruelties. Here, trapped in a pressurized cabin, the microcosm of society had revealed itself with brutal clarity. Dad Caleb's voice was quiet, almost fragile. "Yes, son. What if they still take us off when we land? What if they don't care about the rules?" Jonathan's chest tightened. He had spent years asking himself the same question in different forms. What if the system doesn't care? What if the rules bend for everyone but us? He couldn't lie. Not now. They might try, he admitted softly. But what matters is this. You stood up. You told the truth, and they can't erase that, no matter what they do. Caleb nodded, though his small shoulders slumped. For the first time, Jonathan saw the weight pressing on his son. Bravery was never free. It demanded a toll. Across the aisle, Robert Kane chuckled darkly, clearly emboldened by the lull. Don't fill the boy's head with illusions. Read. This world eats idealists alive. Jonathan turned his head slowly, locking eyes with him. Idealists built the laws you take for granted, and it'll be idealists who keep them alive when cynics like you would let them die. Kane scoffed, but Jonathan didn't miss the flicker in his gaze, the smallest crack in his certainty. Then, from a few rows back, the middle-aged woman spoke again. Her voice was calm, but it carried across the cabin. He's not wrong, you know. We all watched it. We all stayed quiet too long. That boy shamed us into finding our voices, and maybe that's what this world needs more of. Helen Brooks nodded firmly, adding, "History shifts in moments like these. I'll make sure this one is remembered." Frank Dawson leaned forward, his veteran's cap catching the overhead light. "And I'll stand beside them in Denver if it comes to that. You can count on it." Jonathan swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the unexpected chorus of solidarity. He had spent years preparing for battles alone, armored in self-reliance. To feel strangers rallying now ordinary people, awakened by an 8-year-old's courage, was almost too much to process. Caleb, hearing it, sat a little taller. His eyes shone with something fragile yet powerful hope. But Jonathan also knew hope could be dangerous. He had lived long enough to understand that solidarity in the moment didn't always translate to action later. Fear had a way of reclaiming people once the adrenaline drained. He didn't want his son crushed by disappointment. Leaning close, he whispered, "Remember this. Caleb, people are standing with us now because you lit the way. But even if they falter later, even if they grow silent again, you'll still know what you did was right. That's the kind of victory no one can take." Caleb's small face tightened in thought. After a long pause, he whispered back, "Then I'll keep speaking, even if they stop." Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, overcome by a rush of both pride and grief. His boy was choosing a harder road, and he couldn't shield him from it. The plane jolted through a pocket of turbulence. Gasps filled the cabin, followed by nervous laughter. For a brief moment, humanity reasserted itself, shared fear reminding everyone they were, after all, in the same fragile vessel. Karen Mitchell returned down the aisle, her expression taut with barely disguised resentment. She didn't speak to Jonathan or Caleb, but her narrowed eyes lingered on them before moving on. Jonathan recognized the look. It wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Paul Denton, trailing behind her, paused briefly at row 2. His voice was low, so only Jonathan and Caleb could hear. "I didn't want this to get out of hand, but you should prepare yourselves. The captain may have backed down for now, but Denver operations will review the incident. I can't promise how it will go." Jonathan's voice was measured. "We'll be ready, and so will the truth." Paul gave a tight nod, then moved on, clearly relieved to escape the heat of their gaze. Caleb whispered, "He's scared." Jonathan nodded. "He is, because he knows you're right." The hours stretched on. The cabin eventually grew quieter, passengers lulled by the hum of engines and dimmed lights. But Jonathan remained awake, his thoughts circling. He thought of Alana, of her laughter, of her insistence that Caleb was born for something bigger. He thought of every boardroom where he had been doubted, every headline where his name had been dissected. And he thought of this unlikely, airborne courtroom where his son had become their advocate. He turned to Caleb, who was finally drifting into sleep against his side, his small breath steady. Jonathan brushed a hand over his curls, whispering so softly only the stars outside could hear. "You're braver than I ever was at your age, and braver than most men ever become." The truth, pressed heavy against his chest. Bravery always carried a cost. But Jonathan knew, as he watched his son's face soften in sleep, that some costs were worth paying. Because this wasn't just about 2 seats in first class. It was about the kind of world his boy would inherit. And tonight, at 30,000 feet, that world had shifted, if only a little. The first hints of dawn painted the horizon as Midwest Airlines Flight 178 descended toward Denver International Airport. Golden light spilled across the cabin, catching the edges of tired faces, glinting off coffee cups, and softening the tension that had held everyone hostage through the night. Jonathan Reed straightened his posture, smoothing his blazer with deliberate calm. Appearances mattered, he had learned that long ago. To enter a confrontation looking disheveled was to grant the other side an advantage before the first word was spoken. Beside him, Caleb rubbed his eyes, blinking into the new light with a mixture of awe and dread. "Is this where it happens?" Caleb asked, his voice small. Jonathan looked down at his son, resting a steadying hand on his shoulder. "This is where the next part begins. And remember, you've already done the hardest part." The seatbelt sign chimed. Karen Mitchell moved briskly through the aisle, her lips pressed thin, the clipped edge of her announcements betraying nerves. Jonathan watched her hands tremble slightly as she stowed the last service cart. For all her bravado, she was unsettled. Paul Denton lingered by the galley, avoiding Jonathan's eyes. He was a man already calculating reports, rehearsing explanations for his superiors, hoping the morning news wouldn't carry his name. The wheels touched the runway with a jolt that made Caleb clutch his father's hand. The roar of deceleration filled the cabin, then eased into silence, broken only by the scrape of overhead bins unlatching. Passengers stretched, murmured, gathered their belongings. Yet beneath the normal bustle, anticipation throbbed. Everyone knew the landing hadn't ended the story, it had only ushered in the next act. At the jet bridge, 2 uniformed men waited. They weren't TSA, nor airport police. Jonathan recognized the insignia of airline corporate security, suits with badges, company men tasked with quiet containment. Karen's stride grew sharper as she led the way off the aircraft. Her eyes flicked toward the security team, then back to Jonathan with a flicker of triumph. Caleb whispered, "They're here for us." Jonathan crouched slightly, meeting his son's gaze. "They may think so, but remember, truth doesn't bow just because someone wears a badge. Walk with me, head high." They rose from their seats. Passengers paused in the aisle, instinctively making space. Some lowered their phones, but others kept recording, their cameras capturing every step. Jonathan felt the weight of 100 unseen eyes waiting for how this would play out. At the aircraft door, one of the security officers spoke crisply. "Mr. Reed, young man, please come with us." Jonathan's voice was calm, but it carried. On what grounds? The officer hesitated. "Operational review. Standard procedure." Helen Brooks emerged from her row, her notepad already open. "Standard procedure requires a written citation of cause. Do you have it?" The officer blinked, caught off guard. "Ma'am, this isn't your concern." "Oh, it is," Helen replied evenly. "I'm a law professor, and I witnessed every moment of this flight. If you intend to detain Mr. Reed or his son without due cause, I'll see to it that your airline faces consequences you haven't even imagined." Frank Dawson stepped forward too, his veteran's presence carrying quiet authority. "They're not going anywhere without us walking beside them. Try to move them alone, and you'll be dragging a dozen witnesses along." The security men exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't the controlled extraction they had envisioned. The atmosphere had shifted. The power no longer lay in intimidation, but in the visible unity of passengers. Karen's frustration spilled over. This is ridiculous. You can't let them undermine crew authority like this. Jonathan turned, his gaze steady on her. Authority without justice isn't authority. It's abuse. And abuse doesn't get the final word. The words hung in the air, sharp and immovable. Caleb, gripping his father's hand, added softly but clearly, "The law is still the law, even in the sky." A ripple of assent swept through the passengers. Phones lifted higher, capturing every second. The officers, suddenly aware of their vulnerability, lowered their posture. One cleared his throat. "We'll escort you to a conference room for discussion. That's all." Jonathan gave a single nod. "Then we'll go. But not quietly. And not alone." The procession moved through the terminal. Jonathan, Caleb, Helen, Frank, and half a dozen passengers who refused to slip away. The air buzzed with whispers. Travelers stopped to stare, to film, to ask what had happened. Within minutes, snippets of video were already racing across social media. The conference room was stark, fluorescent lit, with a long table and a corporate logo on the wall. Waiting inside was a man in a tailored suit, regional operations director, by the look of him. His expression was tight, polite on the surface, but carrying the impatience of someone dragged from bed to manage a crisis. "Mr. Reed," he began smoothly. "Thank you for your cooperation. I'd like to resolve this matter quickly and quietly." Jonathan sat across from him, Caleb at his side. Quietly. He repeated, "You mean without accountability?" The man's smile faltered. "Let's not escalate. This was a misunderstanding. Our crew must make difficult decisions in real time. Surely you understand." Jonathan leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "What I understand is that your airline attempted to eject a paying passenger and his son based solely on prejudice. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a violation of contract, of federal law, and of basic human dignity." Helen Brooks chimed in, her voice precise. "We all witnessed it. All. And I have it documented, corroborated, and supported by video evidence." The director's composure cracked. He turned toward the officers. "Step outside." They obeyed, leaving the room charged with a silence that felt heavier than the aircraft had at 30,000 feet. Jonathan folded his hands. "You have a choice. You can treat this as a minor inconvenience and bury it, or you can recognize it for what it is, a chance to confront the culture within your airline before it destroys you. Which path do you think will serve you better when this story breaks?" The man's jaw tightened. He knew. He just didn't want to admit it. Caleb, quiet until now, spoke with the clarity of a bell. "If you hide it, more kids like me will get hurt. If you tell the truth, maybe they won't. Isn't that what you're supposed to do, make things better?" The director stared at him, caught off guard by the simple force of a child's words. For a moment, the practiced corporate mask slipped, and something human flickered beneath. "I'll escalate this to headquarters," he said finally. "Immediately." Jonathan nodded once. Decisive, "Do that. And know that we'll be watching." As they rose to leave, Caleb tugged his father's sleeve. "Dad, did we win this time?" Jonathan paused, looking down at him. "We've taken another step. Sometimes winning isn't one big moment, it's refusing to lose. Again and again." Caleb smiled faintly, as if beginning to understand. And outside the conference room, the terminal pulsed with the energy of a story already spreading proof that a single voice, even that of an 8-year-old, could shift the balance between silence and justice. The morning rush at Denver International was already in full swing when Jonathan Reed and Caleb stepped back into the terminal. What struck Jonathan first wasn't the noise of travelers or the hum of rolling suitcases. It was the way people looked at them, not with indifference, but with recognition. Phones had captured the standoff. Videos were already circulating online, captions blazing across screens. 8-year-old boy school's airline with civil rights law. Clips of Caleb's clear, steady voice citing the Civil Rights Act were being shared, dissected, celebrated. Strangers pointed discreetly as father and son passed, whispering words like courage and bravery. Caleb tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad." "Why are they staring?" Jonathan crouched slightly, speaking low. "Because they saw what you did. And sometimes, when truth is spoken loud enough, people can't help but listen." Helen Brooks rejoined them with her notepad tucked under her arm, her phone buzzing endlessly. "Jonathan, I just got a call from a producer at CNN. They want an interview tonight." Frank Dawson chuckled, adjusting his veteran's cap. "And I've already had 2 reporters ask for my number. Looks like the genie's out of the bottle." Jonathan sighed. The last thing he wanted was spectacle. But he also knew silence could be a form of surrender. "We'll talk. But first I want Caleb home safe." As if summoned, a tall man in a charcoal suit approached, flanked by 2 assistants. His presence carried authority, but not the brittle kind Jonathan had seen in Paul Denton or the corporate director. This was someone higher. "Mr. Reed," the man asked smoothly, extending a hand. "I'm David Lasker, Vice President of Customer Integrity for Midwest Airlines. I'd like to personally apologize for what occurred on Flight 178. Jonathan didn't shake his hand immediately. "Apologies are words. What about actions?" Lasker nodded gravely, as if expecting the reply. "We're launching a full review of crew training and accountability measures. We'll also be in contact with you directly about restitution." His gaze flicked toward Caleb. "And, young man, your words last night reminded us of what we stand for. I hope you know how powerful they were." Caleb shifted uncomfortably, glancing up at his father. Jonathan gave a small nod, and only then did Caleb answer softly. "The law should protect everyone. That's all I said." Lasker smiled faintly, though his eyes betrayed calculation. Sometimes the simplest truths are the hardest to remember. When the executive moved on, Helen leaned close. "Don't let them frame this as PR cleanup. Make them commit to structural change." Jonathan gave her a look of weary gratitude. "That's exactly what I intend." By mid-afternoon, the story had exploded. Hashtags trended across Twitter, beer flying while black. Caleb Reed, know your rights. A 30-second clip of Caleb declaring, "The law is still the law, even in the sky," had been retweeted over 1 million times. In a quiet corner of the airport lounge, Jonathan scrolled through headlines. Boy. 8 defends mom on flight shames airline into backing down. Another read, when a child knows the law better than the crew. Caleb leaned over his father's arm, eyes wide. "Dad, why are they writing about me? Because you reminded them of something they'd forgotten." Jonathan answered, but even as he spoke, unease rippled in his chest. He didn't want his son's courage turned into spectacle, stripped of nuance, repackaged for clicks. Frank Dawson broke the tension with a gravelly laugh. "Kid, you're more famous than half the politicians in this country right now." Caleb frowned. "But I didn't do it to be famous." Jonathan's heart tightened. He drew his son close. "And that's exactly why it matters. Fame fades. Truth doesn't." 2 days later, Jonathan sat in a boardroom not at Reed Global Holdings, but at Midwest Airlines headquarters. The room smelled faintly of leather and coffee, the long table gleaming under fluorescent lights. Across from him sat a half-dozen executives, including David Lasker. Behind Jonathan were Helen Brooks and 2 civil rights attorneys who had volunteered to represent the family pro bono. Caleb sat quietly beside him, swinging his legs, a sketchbook in hand. His crayons moved across the page scales of justice, uneven at first, then corrected with a child's determination. The executives began with platitudes: unfortunate incident, valued customers, commitment to diversity. Jonathan listened, expression impassive, until the words rang hollow in his ears. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice cutting through their practiced tones. Let me make this clear. What happened on Flight 178 wasn't a PR inconvenience. It was a civil rights violation. My son should never have had to defend his mother against prejudice at 30,000 feet. And if you think a press release will make this go away, you're gravely mistaken. The room fell silent. Caleb stopped coloring, looking up at his father with wide eyes. Helen Brooks slid a packet of documents across the table. Here are the statements from passengers, the video evidence, and the legal precedents. This airline is now in violation of, unless substantial reforms are enacted, a lawsuit will follow. And it won't just be about damages, it'll be about systemic accountability. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. Lasker cleared his throat. What exactly are you asking for? Jonathan's reply was calm, deliberate. Mandatory anti-bias training for all staff. A transparent reporting channel for discrimination complaints, overseen by an independent board. And a passenger rights advocate on every major flight, empowered to intervene when authority is abused. One executive bristled. That's costly, unrealistic. Jonathan met his gaze without flinching. Not as costly as the lawsuits you'll face when the next Caleb Reed stands up, and there will be a next, unless you change. The question is whether you want to lead that change, or be dragged into it. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint scratch of Caleb's crayon as he resumed drawing. DUEB. The reforms wouldn't come overnight. Jonathan knew that, but the ripple effect was already moving beyond the boardroom. Community leaders called, offering support. Civil rights groups reached out, eager to amplify the story. Journalists flooded Jonathan's inbox, hungry for interviews, and, perhaps most surprisingly, Robert Kane, the businessman who had mocked them on the flight, issued a public statement admitting his bias and pledging a 6-figure donation to the Caleb Reed Scholarship Fund, newly established by Helen and Frank. Jonathan read the statement twice, skeptical but curious. Redemption was never simple, but if even Kane felt compelled to change, then perhaps something deeper had shifted. One evening, Jonathan found Caleb sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the news playing on the muted TV. His drawing lay unfinished beside him, an airplane balanced on scales of justice. Dad, Caleb asked, "Did we make it better, or did we just make it louder?" Jonathan sat down, pulling him close. He thought of Alana, of her faith that truth could move mountains. He thought of the faces on the plane, the silent ones, the defiant ones, the ones who found courage at last. "You made it better," Jonathan said quietly, "because you reminded them to listen. And once people start listening, real change becomes possible." Caleb leaned against him, a small smile breaking through. "Then I'll keep talking, even if my voice shakes." Jonathan kissed the top of his son's head, a swell of pride and sorrow rising together. "That's all I could ever ask. Son, that's all the world could ever need." The ballroom at the Hyatt Regency in downtown Denver gleamed with polished marble and crystal chandeliers. Rows of tables stretched across the floor, each adorned with white linens and gold-rimmed glasses. On the stage, a banner read, "Caleb Reed Scholarship Fund, Inaugural Gala." Jonathan Reed stood near the entrance, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate calm. He had spent years attending corporate banquets, yet this evening carried a weight unlike any other. Tonight wasn't about quarterly earnings or market expansion. Tonight was about his son and about the truth that had reverberated from 30,000 feet into the heart of a nation. Caleb tugged at his jacket sleeve, his small bow tie slightly crooked. "Dad, do I have to make a speech?" Jonathan knelt, meeting his son's anxious eyes. "You don't have to do anything, Caleb, but if you want to, people are here to listen, and sometimes listening is the most powerful thing they can do." Caleb chewed his lip. "What if I mess up?" Jonathan smiled softly. "Then you'll keep going. Remember, courage isn't about being perfect. It's about standing even when your knees shake." Helen Brooks approached, her notepad tucked under her arm as always. "The press is out in full force," she murmured. "CNN, the New York Times, even BBC. And donors are pledging more by the hour. We've already crossed 2 million. Frank Dawson adjusted his veteran's cap, grinning broadly. Not bad for a scholarship that didn't even exist 2 months ago. Jonathan exhaled slowly. He had learned to distrust numbers. They could rise and fall like tides. What mattered was whether the people behind them carried conviction beyond the cameras. The lights dimmed, and the MC's voice filled the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our honored guest, Mr. Jonathan Reed." Applause thundered. Jonathan walked to the podium, his shoes clicking against polished wood. He glanced at the crowd: executives, activists, teachers, veterans, students, ordinary citizens whose lives had intersected, however briefly, with the courage of an 8-year-old boy. He began quietly, his voice steady. "When my son and I boarded Flight 178 from Columbus to Denver, we weren't seeking a spotlight. We were just trying to get home. But prejudice has a way of finding you even 30,000 feet above the ground." A ripple of murmurs swept the audience. Jonathan continued, "That night, it wasn't me who changed the course of events. It was Caleb. My son reminded an entire cabin, and eventually an entire country, that the law is still the law, even in the sky. He reminded us that dignity is not a privilege, it's a right." The room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Jonathan's throat tightened, but he pressed on. The Caleb Reed Scholarship Fund is not just about education, it's about accountability. It's about ensuring that when the next child speaks truth to power, they're not standing alone. He stepped aside, motioning to Caleb. "And now, if he's willing, I'd like you to hear from the boy himself." The crowd leaned forward as Caleb shuffled onto the stage, clutching a small index card. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice, when it came, was clear. "I didn't know everyone would care about what I said on the plane," he began. "I just wanted my mom and dad to be treated fair. I read in a book once that laws are like promises, and I think grown-ups should keep their promises. That's all." Laughter and applause blended, warm and affirming. Caleb glanced at his father, who gave a reassuring nod. "So, this fund," Caleb continued, his small voice rising, "is to help kids like me, kids who want to learn about fairness and justice. Because if more kids know the rules, maybe someday grown-ups will stop breaking them." The crowd rose to its feet, a standing ovation swelling into a roar. Jonathan felt his chest ache with pride and sorrow all at once. His son had taken the raw pain of that night and turned it into something luminous. As the applause subsided, a figure stepped forward from the audience. It was Robert Kane, the businessman who had once mocked them on the flight. He wore a dark suit, his expression earnest. "May I speak?" he asked, his voice tentative. The room quieted. Jonathan's instinct was to bristle, but he caught the sincerity in Kane's eyes. He gave a curt nod. Kane cleared his throat. "That night, I was wrong. I let prejudice guide my words. I humiliated myself, but worse, I contributed to the humiliation of others. Since then, I've had to face hard truths about who I am. Tonight, I stand here not for absolution, but to pledge $1 million to the Caleb Reed Scholarship Fund, and to pledge myself to listening more than I speak. Gasps swept the ballroom, followed by thunderous applause. Jonathan studied him carefully. Redemption was never simple, but perhaps sincerity could start somewhere. After the speeches, music filled the hall. Guests mingled, donors signed checks, students shared stories of their dreams. Caleb darted between tables, his bow tie askew, laughing with children who looked at him as if he were a hero. Jonathan found a quiet corner, watching his son. Helen joined him, her voice low. You realize this is bigger than a scholarship, don't you? It's becoming a movement. Jonathan nodded slowly. Movements are fragile. They can be twisted, co-opted. But if Caleb remains at its heart, if truth remains at its heart, maybe it has a chance. Frank Dawson approached, holding 2 glasses of water. To courage, he said simply, raising one. Jonathan clinked his glass softly. To courage, and to the cost of it. As the evening wore on, Jonathan slipped outside onto the terrace. The city lights stretched endlessly, stars shimmering faintly above. He thought of Alana, her absence sharp, but her presence somehow woven into everything. He imagined her smile, her voice telling Caleb bedtime stories of heroes who dared to speak truth. He whispered into the night, he's becoming everything you dreamed. Alana, and more. Behind him. The doors opened. Caleb patted out, slipping his small hand into his father's. Did I do okay? Dad. Jonathan bent, pulling him into an embrace. You did more than okay. You reminded them all what justice sounds like. Together, they stood beneath the stars, father and son, bound by truth, dignity, and a promise larger than themselves. And in that moment, Jonathan knew the turbulence that had shaken their flight was only the beginning of a journey that would ripple across generations. At its heart, this story reminds us that dignity is not a luxury, it is a right. An 8-year-old boy reminded adults that the law applies to everyone, everywhere, even in the confined space of an airplane cabin. His courage teaches us that truth does not require age, status, or permission. It only requires the will to speak. For older audiences, the lesson may resonate even more deeply. Silence often allows injustice to grow. Many of us have lived through moments when keeping our heads down felt safer, but every generation benefits when someone dares to say, "This is wrong." The ripple effect of one brave voice can awaken an entire community. This story also shows that justice isn't only won in courtrooms, it is lived in everyday choices, in how we treat strangers, and in whether we choose to step forward or look away. And, perhaps most importantly, it teaches us that children are watching. They learn from us, but sometimes they remind us of truths we've forgotten. The boy's courage calls us to live with integrity, to defend dignity, and to pass on a world where fairness isn't optional, but expected. That is a legacy worth leaving. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. Stories like this remind us of the power of courage, dignity, and truth. If it touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter.